In 1820 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhat III, and when he was 40 years old, he had two dreams which disturbed him. In the first dream, he was standing by the Nile River, admiring its beauty. He was surprised to see 7 fat cows walk out of the river, climb onto the bank, and begin grazing on the lush grass. Then 7 lean cows came up out of the water, went into the meadow, and stood beside the 7 fat cows. But instead of grazing, they swallowed up the 7 fat cows. Pharaoh awoke feeling troubled, but thought it was just a bad dream. He fell asleep. He had another dream. This time he saw 7 heads of corn on the one stalk. Then he saw 7 heads of corn ruined by blight from an east wind. He awoke in a sweat, feeling that these dreams were a dire premonition, but he couldn't understand them. When the household staff couldn't interpret the dreams for him, he called for the magicians and wise men. A female servant ran to fetch them. Entering their midst as they sat munching cucumber and tomato, the servant breathlessly stated, "Pharaoh has had nightmares and we cannot interpret them. Come at once." She left the room and the men reluctantly left their breakfast and followed her. They found Pharaoh seated at his breakfast table. They were invited to sit. Pharaoh described his dreams, but they could not explain their meaning either. The butler, who had been standing nearby, spoke up. "I had a dream while I was in prison, and so did the baker. One of the other prisoners interpreted our dreams, and they both came true as he predicted." "What was the man's name?" asked Pharaoh. "Is he still in prison?" "Probably. He's a Hebrew called Joseph." "Bring him at once," Pharaoh ordered his men. As a youth, Joseph had been sold into slavery by his jealous brothers and ended up in Egypt, where he had been falsely accused of accosting an official's wife. He was imprisoned in the dungeon. But in all this, God had a plan for his benefit. Joseph lay in his cell praying. His stomach gnawed at him. His meagre breakfast hadn't arrived yet. There were mutterings among the guards, and it sounded as if something were amiss. Then footsteps approached in haste down the stone corridor. Joseph stood up. "What's going on?" he asked the keeper of the jail, with whom he had favour. But before he could answer, a messenger appeared and spoke to the jailer. "Where is the Hebrew Joseph?" The keeper pointed at Joseph. "That is he. You must give him to me at once, for Pharaoh calls for him." The keeper moved reluctantly to open the cell of his most useful prisoner. "Hurry up, it's urgent," said the messenger. The keeper led Joseph to the door and said, "The gods be with you." Joseph was speechless. They both knew this was Joseph's final moment in prison. The messenger had already hurried off down the corridor. A guard escorted Joseph away, but instead of being taken to Pharaoh, Joseph was led to an unoccupied community washroom, where he stood in surprise. "Come over here," said the messenger, standing by a bench laden with barber's tools, lotions, bowls, and scent bottles. "You must appear before Pharaoh, clean and shaven." Joseph's beard was long and straggly. He cut and shaved his beard, bathed, and was attired in a white linen skirt. His hair was styled into a kind of page boy with a band of cloth around his head. It had all taken around 1 hour, and the servants had even fed him as they worked and explained something about dream interpretation. Could this be the breakthrough for which he had prayed so long? Finally, Joseph was brought outside onto a covered stone porch with steps leading down to the Nile. It was a truly beautiful sight after the ugly, colourless dungeon, and the fresh air was heavenly as a cool morning breeze caressed his body. At the opposite end of the porch was a scarlet curtain. It parted as 2 soldiers, a scribe, and 2 servants entered, Behind them followed Pharaoh in regal poise. The copperhead spears of the soldiers glittered in the light. "Are you Joseph the Hebrew?" asked Pharaoh as he approached. Joseph bowed low. "Yes, great Pharaoh." "Come, sit." He nodded to the servants, and 2 chairs were brought out and placed opposite one another. They were seated. The scribe sat on a flat cushion beside them and prepared to write. Joseph had to wait until first spoken to. Pharaoh began, "I have had 2 dreams, and there is no one who can interpret them. But I have been told that you can interpret dreams." "I am unable to interpret without the answer of God. It is He who will give Pharaoh peace as a confirmation." Pharaoh told Joseph his dreams. Joseph thought it strange that no one could guess at such an easy puzzle. He immediately knew the meaning of the dreams. He was also secretly enjoying the wonderful feeling of freedom. Though how things were going to go for him this time, he didn't know. He spoke, knowing that his answer could mean life or death. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 fat cows are 7 years of plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them, 7 years of famine will arise, and the famine will deplete the land. The dream of the spikes of corn confirms the meaning of the first dream. God will shortly bring this to pass. Then Joseph hardly dared to breathe. Pharaoh nodded slowly and appeared satisfied with the interpretation. The soldiers and servants relaxed visibly. Pharaoh asked, "What would your God advise?" Joseph breathed again and smiled, but Pharaoh appeared serious, so Joseph prayed quickly for God's answer, then said, "Let Pharaoh appoint officials throughout Egypt to collect 1/5 of the produce to store up for the next 7 years. Distribute the stores to the cities as a reserve for the 7 years of famine." Pharaoh smiled. Pleasure was expressed by all present. Pharaoh agreed and said, "Is there anyone like this man who has the Spirit of God?" He rose, and Joseph stood also. "You are the wisest and most discerning man I have met. I thank Pharaoh." Pharaoh turned toward the Nile and paced in silence for a few moments, then turned back to Joseph. "You shall be over my house, and all Egypt shall be ruled by your word. You will be the highest in Egypt, except for my throne." Pharaoh's people glanced around at one another in surprise. Joseph shook his head in amazement, then bowed low. "Pharaoh is great in wisdom," he said. Joseph was shown around the country by chariot and declared ruler. He was 30 years old when he became vizier of Egypt. He selected for his home the part of Egypt which had the highest rainfall, the Nile Delta in Goshen. He channeled water from the Nile into a man-made lake called Fayum as a water source, the waterway of Joseph. This created a basin for farming. He learned to read hieroglyphics, which consisted of nearly 1,000 signs. Everything he did prospered. He married an Egyptian woman, and they had 2 sons during the years of plenty. He began to develop the world's first alphabet, he called Aleph-Bet, named after its first 2 letters. During his reign, Joseph taught the sages the true meaning of the constellations. Fascinated by the stars, the Egyptians added the information to their own observations. The sign of Virgo pointed to the virgin birth of the Hebrew Messiah. Joseph also told them that God had predicted that one day the Hebrews would be slaves to Egypt, but would leave the country with great wealth. This was not received so well, though it seemed that even the constellation Sagittarius spoke of a future battle of horsemen which would be lost. Only 2 years after the fruitful years, the famine became severe. The wealth was depleted from the cities along the Nile and ended up concentrated with Pharaoh, altering the economy of the land. At this time, 10 of Joseph's 11 brothers travelled from Canaan to Egypt to buy grain. As Joseph sold the grain, they came before him and bowed low, but they didn't recognize him. Not only was he a grown man dressed in Egyptian garb, but he also had dyed his hair red with henna after the practice of Egypt. Joseph recognized his brothers, but spoke to them in Egyptian through an interpreter. He accused them of being spies and threw them in prison for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he gave them instructions to bring their youngest brother to him. They discussed among themselves how Joseph's blood was on their hands, and this was their punishment. Joseph stood by, understanding every word, unbeknownst to them. Eventually, after strategic maneuvers to test their character, Joseph met with all his brothers in private and revealed his true identity. He forgave them for their treachery, seeing that it had led him to become governor of Egypt according to God's plan. Then Joseph's father Jacob and his family came to settle in the land of Goshen with their livestock. Jacob's sheep fed throughout the delta as the family of 70 eventually grew into 20 towns, including Joseph's town of Avaris. Joseph showed his brothers the use of the throw stick, a self-defense weapon used by Egyptian officials. He taught them the alphabet. They also learned to read some hieroglyphics. The Hebrews prospered. But some years later, that changed dramatically when Egypt enslaved the Hebrews as God had predicted.